Guten Morgen. Ich spreche Deutsch nicht sehr gut, so ich spreche English. Vielen Dank. I try. I'm trying. I want to spend more time in Germany, obviously. Good morning, folks. It's wonderful to be here in Wiesbaden today. This conference is really exciting for me because it's a great audience, tools for agile teams, and we're talking about all sorts of different tools and practices today. And indeed, we did last night as well at the Agile Games. When reflecting on my experience with agile and agile transformations at companies big and small, I came to realise that success is predicated on teams delivering value to their customers. That's what it comes down to. And the theme for this year's conference here at Tools for Agile Teams is strong teams, strong process, strong technology, and strong software. And I chose to focus on strong teams because I felt without strong teams, nothing else matters, right? We've got to get the foundation right, and then we can go on to improving the effectiveness of the teams with other tools and techniques. So this morning, we're going to explore how to build and how to create and maintain strong teams. Okay, so what's a strong team? Some people are going to tell you that a strong team is defined by its process. The Scrum Alliance will tell you it's Scrum. Dean Leffingwell will tell you that SAFe is the only way to scale agile in an organisation. Pivotal Labs will tell you that you have to do pair programming and TDD. And it just so happens that the things that these companies or these tribes are telling you that you need to do for an agile transformation to be successful are the things that they are selling themselves. And so I think that there's a bit of a conflict of interest there. And it begs the question, if process and what they're selling is not what means or what makes an agile team or a strong agile company, then what is it? And so I believe that, from my experience, at least what I've seen at Atlassian, at Twitter, and other companies large and small that I've worked with, a strong team and the success of agile in an organisation is defined by a number of traits. And in fact, there's 5 traits that I've seen time and again that I believe are a really good indicator of whether we have strong teams and whether we're going to have a successful agile transformation. The first of this is impact. Is the team customer focused? Are they focused on delivering value to their customer? The second is quality. Do they deliver quality the first time around? And if they're delivering quality, then they're minimising waste in the entire system. The third is flow. They have this capability to deliver software or deliver value to their customers incrementally so that they can learn continuously from their customers. The fourth is Kaizen, a Japanese word, but it's continuously improve. They have this capability to continuously improve how they operate as a team. And finally, it's courage. The team works in an environment where they can have forthright conversations with one another, where they can challenge one another to make sure that they're delivering the best solution for the customer, and indeed they're finding the best environment to work in as a team. So I was hoping to get a show of hands now, based on strong teams, impact, quality, flow, Kaizen, and courage. Can I get a show of hands, who works on a strong team today? That's fantastic. I reckon we've got about half of the audience there, about 40 to 50% of the audience stuck their hands up working on a strong team. That's awesome. I hope for you that you get some tools and techniques that you can take to improve the teams that you already work on. For those of you that don't feel like you work on a strong team today, I'd love to see that you can take 1 or 2 things from this talk, experiment with them in your own organisation, and start to build some strong teams in your company. So, I want to dispel the myth, right? Agile is a mindset, first and foremost. It's a mindset that allows our teams and our people to think about ways to adapt and change as our business environment adapts and changes over time. You know, the agile transformation that's right for one company is not going to be right for another company. And so it's really about learning and responding to feedback and being capable of changing that's so key to agile. And there's not a causal relationship between a particular process and a successful agile transformation. Now, this morning I'm sharing with you my experience. This is not advice, okay? I don't believe that there is one process or one practice that is suitable for every team. I believe it's very much dependent upon the context and the situation in which we find ourselves as a particular team or organisation. So with that said, we're going to focus on building and fostering strong teams in our companies. And we're going to look at 4 pieces today. First of which, we're going to look at how to hire amazing people. Then we're going to look at the vivid vision, which is a technique to align teams. We'll then look at team effectiveness, and we'll follow up and finish with continuous learning and continuous improvement for the team. So, hiring amazing people. At Twitter, in the first 12 months of my time at Twitter, we hired over 1,000 engineers. This company was a rocket ship. We were consuming people because we had such grand ambitions for where we wanted to take the company. And we were burning through a chunk of VC money, and we wanted to take the company public. It was not the way to scale an organisation. However, in 2012, we bought a company that became a group at Twitter called Fabric. They were the Crashlytics team. They became Fabric at Twitter. And they grew from around 20 at the time of acquisition to nearly 100. And Fabric, or Crashlytics, when we acquired them, they had a really interesting technique for hiring. And that technique was to focus on competencies, the competencies of the people or of the candidates that they were interviewing. And so for every open role that the Fabric team had in their group, they had a job description which was publicly posted on the website. You know, this is what we're looking for, this is the sort of work that you're going to be doing, the sort of people you'll be working with. But they also had an internal list which was the competencies that they sought in their candidates. And these competencies were things like the ability to collaborate, the ability to communicate. Seems pretty sane, right? Did they exhibit adaptability, or were they rigid in their ways? You know, they wanted to look for creative problem solving. They wanted to look for ownership of problems. And these competencies were really the yardstick with which the team or the interviewing panel would assess a candidate. Now, obviously, they were assessing a whole host of things, but the competencies were key, and in fact, the most important aspect. And so the technique that the Fabric team used, and which we ultimately rolled across all of product and engineering, was a hiring technique called top grading. Now, with top grading, it's basically a longitudinal survey of every role you've ever held in your career. So if you've been working for 10 years, you know, maybe your early 30s or something like that, in 10 years you might have been through maybe 10 different roles at 3 different companies. And what we would do is, over the course of 2 hours, we would ask 10 questions of the candidate about every role they had over that preceding 10 or 15 year period since they left school, since they left university. And asking these same questions for every role allowed us to establish and identify patterns. Those patterns helped us understand whether they matched the competencies or not that we were seeking. And so, for instance, the questions that we would ask, there was always 2 interviewers in a top grading interview. There was the person that was taking notes furiously, and there was the person that was asking the questions. And obviously there was the candidate. They were always done face to face. And the 10 questions were, what was your role? What were you hired to do in this role? What were the highlights of your time in this role? What were the lowlights of your time in this role? Who was your manager? What was your manager's name? How do you spell your manager's name? I'm going to call that manager and ask them for a reference. What would your manager say were your highlights? What would your manager say were your lowlights? What would your manager rate you on a scale of 1 to 10? And finally, why did you leave that role and move on to the next role or the next company? So it's very structured. It's not a waffling interview conversation. And this structure allows us to identify whether the candidate has the competencies that we're seeking. So for instance, if we establish in the first job that they had out of university that they didn't respond well to feedback from their manager, and that was one of the low points that they had, I kept having problems with my manager. And we also saw that coming up in the job that they had 10 years later. We knew that that wasn't a candidate we wanted to pursue. And so top grading, along with the competencies, was a really great way for us to make sure that we were getting the right candidates in the funnel. It was also really important for us to make sure that we had a diverse slate of candidates. The peer-reviewed research, and indeed our own experience at Twitter, showed that that more diverse teams actually they make better decisions, they ask more powerful questions of one another, and they arrive at better solutions for their customers. We had a couple of different approaches at Twitter. This is globally, but some of the ones that we used in San Francisco and America were WOMENG, so Women in Engineering. We had Blackbirds, which was the African American cohort in North America, and Girls Who Code. And Girls Who Code was bringing 15 and 16-year-old girls into Twitter for a 3-month coding internship, essentially, over their summer holidays, in the hope that they would continue on through high school into university and pick up a STEM subject. And so we had a very large emphasis on the diversity of our candidate pool. And one of the things that was really key when we were looking at this candidate pool as well was that we had complementary skill sets for our existing team. One of the things that we learned from other companies in Silicon Valley was that they would just chuck everyone into a pile. And if you got a job, then you'd get sent out to that team, or you'd get farmed out to that team. And you might never have been even interviewed by the team that you got assigned to. And in our conversations with other companies in Silicon Valley, we couldn't understand why this was the case, because we felt that there was such an importance of having the people that you're going to be working with interview you. Now, you might not be working with them for 2 years. You might only be working with them for 3 to 9 months before you move on to another project or something changes. But we felt that it was super important to make sure that we had these complementary team members, and it worked out particularly well for us. We didn't focus on simply hiring great Java engineers or great Scala engineers. We really focused on that team fit and identifying people that had a lot of passion and determination and capability to learn over and above their actual technical capabilities. And so the T-shaped people was super important for us. So the things that we did for hiring amazing people, we looked obviously at the competencies, and we identified those competencies of candidates via top grading in the interview process. We replicated that practice across all of the hiring that we did in product and engineering, and ultimately ended up with much better teams. And if I give you an example of strong team cohesion that came out of this, we had one team in particular, the Gazebo team. And the Gazebo team took this to heart, they grew their team, and they got to the point where they had such strong team cohesion that every day they would have breakfast at 8 to 8:45. And in that scenario then, a standard Scrum ritual like the daily stand-up doesn't make any sense. Because this team has such great cohesion, they know what's going on with one another day in, day out, but they don't need a stand-up, right? And so that's why I think we focus on the teams and hiring amazing people. So with that, we'll look at the vivid vision. In 2007, shortly after I joined Atlassian, Scott Farquhar, one of the founders of the company, returned from Entrepreneurs Organization, which is a group of entrepreneurs that come together to share ideas. And one of the things that he brought back was the vivid vision. The vivid vision is a letter to the employees of the company, written today, but looking back 3 years in the future. What did we achieve as a company? What do we look like as a company? How does it feel to be an Atlassian? And this vivid vision was a very powerful tool for Scott and Mike, the founders of Atlassian, to bring to the employees in early 2008. It shared with all the employees what Mike and Scott felt the company would look like in 3 years' time. And it was such a rich vision of the future that it allowed every person in the company to come together and say, we've got to get out of our day-to-day and we've got to up-level and go to the next level. I'm getting worried about this little thing down here. Are we doing the right thing here? Forget about that. Put that to one side. How do we get the company to that huge place in the future? And this vivid vision worked superbly well for the entire team. It aligned everyone in the company. And it allowed us to make big shifts in the way that we were running the company to go and reach that next growth inflection point. From the vivid vision, the product managers and the engineering managers, in concert with the teams, we rolled back and we said, what's our roadmap look like? For our products and for our company, how do we go and achieve these audacious goals that Mike and Scott have set for us? Because this vivid vision didn't give us any instructions on how to get there. It just said, that's where we're going to be. And so it was a really great motivator for us, but it left us with no idea how to get there. So we had to work together to build these roadmaps across all of the products, make sure they were aligned, and then work to deliver those so that we could actually achieve and meet that vision. And in fact, we did. We went above and beyond the vision that they'd set. On the roadmap, we found it particularly valuable as product managers to always open a backlog grooming session with the roadmap, just to bring all of the team up that level so that they focused, where are we going 6 to 12 months out? One of the techniques that I learned about at Twitter, in fact, we were not this sophisticated at Atlassian back in the day, but it's a technique that I found at Twitter that worked extremely well, and that's objectives, key results, or OKRs. Andy Grove at Intel pushed this forward. And all teams come together once a quarter, and the team comes together to set their goals, which are their key results. These are the metrics that we want to see move. And these metrics, these key results, are going to help us achieve a particular objective, which is our customer, the value that we want to deliver to our customers. At the end of each quarter, we would get every team in product and engineering at Twitter to print out their objectives, key results for the quarter just finished and how they graded themselves on that, as well as the objectives, key results for the coming quarter that they are about to start. The key thing here is that the objectives, key results were not individual. The smallest unit that we ever dealt with at Twitter was a team. The team won together, they lost together. They graded their own OKRs. There was no one that was going to hit them with a stick if they didn't hit them, if they didn't meet their OKRs. It was on them to do the best job. So the vivid vision at Atlassian plus the roadmap were two techniques that worked particularly well. And adding to that the OKR technique at Twitter, it's this phenomenal combination that works really well as you scale and grow an organisation. And that's what I've seen in my experience. Because the teams were holding themselves accountable to their own definition of success. So turning attention to team effectiveness. I mentioned earlier that we had this huge growth in the number of engineers. We brought on over 1,000 engineers in the first 12 months I was there. So clearly it was pretty important that these people, these engineers, were effective. And that was my role, was to make sure that these people were effective. As the thinking went, if we're hiring all these people, if they're not working on the right stuff, if they're not getting stuff done, then obviously there's a tremendous amount of waste. And so under the leadership of Chris Fry and Steve Green, we started working with the engineering directors and the product directors to help those people have a sense of and really ask questions that were focused on the lean principles, so eliminating waste. We basically changed the whole way that these directors in the company were asking questions. Instead of asking, when's it going to be done, they were getting to the point where they were asking their product managers, what can we do to help? What are the impediments? What's the bottleneck? What's the constraint? And that was their focus. It was always about living up to the lean principles and imbuing those principles through their teams. So that was a very top-down thing for the lean principles. One of the ones that we had to work very much bottom-up with every engineering manager and every product manager was optimizing the whole. We found in 2013 at Twitter that there were a number of teams. I suppose they built their little collective and they didn't want to be impacted or disrupted by anyone else because there'd been so much change and growth. They didn't have great relationships across the organisation, so they tried to go look inwards and protect themselves so that they could actually get work done. But in doing so, it led to some negative behaviour, like one team, for instance, they chose their own JavaScript testing framework. One team out of 2,000 plus engineers has a JavaScript testing framework. Everyone else uses a different JavaScript testing framework. Probably makes this team go faster, but on the whole, it made the entire organisation slower because that team, which was super important, it was harder for people to contribute to their code base because they had to get a different build system set up. They had to get different tooling set up on their computer. And so we tried to put in place some guardrails to help the teams move faster together and optimize the entire company, potentially at the expense of optimizing one particular team. So developer productivity, or DevProd as it was called, was one such effort to standardize the build, test and deploy lifecycle across the engineering organization at Twitter. And the thinking went that if we can save 10,000 minutes per day, we're saving a tremendous amount of time over the course of the year. And a small example of that was they saved 5 minutes on a deploy cycle And we were doing in excess of 2,000 deploys a day. Sometimes it was one engineer doing multiple deploys. Other times it was, you could see 1,200 engineers had done a deploy during the course of the day. But it was just a massive impact. And so this developer productivity team was super high leverage. And it got to the point where we took developer productivity from a team of 7 to an organisation or a group called Engineering Effectiveness. And it numbered about 70 people. And it was super high leverage because everything they did made the life of another 2,000 engineers way better. So they were loved. It was a really cool role for them because they could go into the canteen, the cafeteria, and everyone would say, oh, hey, thanks for saving me a couple of minutes today. But it was, from a fun point of view, they had a great role, but it was also very important for us as we were scaling the organisation. And so this developer productivity group, I think, was one of the most impactful things that we'd seen for the day-to-day effectiveness of the engineers. One of the things that we had to focus on for the leaders was actually around stability. We had an incident at Twitter in early 2015, in about February 2015, and it was called a code red, right? And these code reds, I think they maybe occurred 2 or 3 times in my time at Twitter, but this particular code red was a bad one. It was so bad that about 70 people were pulled off various teams in the organisation by the engineering leadership, and they were put onto one project with one existing team to solve a problem. And this was bad for all sorts of reasons, not only because there's now 40 teams across the organisation who had objectives and key results for the quarter, which just got blown up because they'd lost team members that were working on critical aspects of that. But you can't take 70 people and put them with a team of 10 people and expect that the team of 10 is going to be able to train up 70 people overnight. And so it showed a real weakness in our engineering leadership that they would do something like this. And so we put together some data that showed that there was a correlation, a very strong correlation, between the stability of a team and their capability to get stuff done and deliver outcomes for their customers. And it's surprising to say this, but that data was what actually changed the mind of our at the time, VP of Engineering, and we started to repeal and rethink this approach to having code reds. So some of these things are things that I hope that you never encounter in your own organisations, but certainly they were interesting experiences to see these taking place at companies like Twitter. So lean principles with a focus on optimising the whole. We also talked about stability of the teams and the growth of the engineering effectiveness group so that we actually made all of these teams across the company more effective. The final piece that I wanted to touch on was the continuous learning. And so this was expected at Atlassian and at Twitter, and indeed at many companies in Silicon Valley. It's expected that you as an individual are on a journey of continuous learning. The approaches at both companies were very similar. I think I think back to a really enjoyable, a difficult but enjoyable session for me was when I was asked to run a retrospective for the safety team at Twitter. And up until this point, I'd been a product manager, I'd run many retrospectives, but they were pretty formulaic. They were quite boring. I tried to change it up and do some different exercises, but they were always exercises in a boardroom or in a meeting room around a whiteboard. It was really boring thinking about that and looking back on it now. In 2014, I had an experience with this team where they were not receptive to change at all, but there was a lot of angst and anger in this team that the product manager was sensing, and they wanted me to come in and help see if we could tease it out and figure out what was going on. But because the team was absolutely not receptive at all to the idea of a retrospective, it actually came down to, hey folks, do you want to go for a coffee? Why don't we go get a coffee at the coffee shop? And that's what it became. It was just taking the whole team down to the coffee shop and saying, oh, we don't have to rush back to the office. Let's sit down. Oh, okay. And everyone starts to sit down. And in this environment that took them out of the office, where they've got a coffee in hand, they started to bitch and moan about all the things that were bothering them in working with another team, or indeed another couple of teams at the company. And we would never have been able to get this team to open up like that in a traditional retrospective in the style that I've been running. In a room, post-it notes, markers, all that sort of stuff. It would just never have happened. And I later heard from the product manager that it was the best retrospective that they'd seen in their time, and it was the most effective because this team had taken a couple of takeaways and they'd started to build deeper relationships with the other teams that they were working with that they'd really struggled to work with previously. So it was a great learning experience for me to say that, you know, always be experimenting with new approaches. In terms of experimenting, like, you know, we had this mantra both at Atlassian and Twitter of back to school. You're always learning. You never finish learning. You know, we wanted to have a sustainable pace for people so that they always had time to learn in their regular week. You know, we had things like the book club, read one chapter a week, you discuss it over lunch or perhaps for 30 minutes in the morning, pay for tuition to an external course or an online course if needed, paying some people to conferences like this, of course. One of the things that was interesting at Twitter was the leadership of the company felt that learning and continuous learning was so valuable that they actually bought a 10-person training company called Maracana, and they basically said, like, these 10 people, they did training all around the world for a whole host of different technologies and practices. And they said, forget about all that business, we're going to give you equity, we're going to give you salaries, we're going to buy your business, and you're just going to train Twitter employees. That's all you're going to do. And so these people came on board and they built Twitter University. And every day of the week, every week of the year, every office we had globally, 35 offices, they were running training sessions. You were in the sales team, you could do a 5-day iOS or a 5-day Android course if you wanted. You're an engineer that wanted to learn Scala or Swift or anything else, you could go do it. You could just take time out of your regularly scheduled program to go and do this, and it was expected that you did. And in fact, if you didn't, the question would be asked from your manager, why aren't you? Why haven't you gone to Twitter University recently? Is everything okay? So the Twitter University was very valuable for encouraging the entire corpus to improve. And we also did things like the flocks. You know, you get people together to capture that tacit knowledge out of people's heads and turn it into common knowledge across the organisation. So that if someone leaves the organisation, they don't take that knowledge with them. It's shared there, it's recorded, it's captured as a video, it's blogged on Confluence, so anyone can refer back to it in the future. So the flocks, again, this was something that was organised by the Twitter University and the Engineering Effectiveness Group, but it was very valuable for sharing knowledge throughout the organisation. So, continuous improvement of the people was key at both Atlassian and Twitter, and it never stopped. It was always expected. We've touched on hiring people, aligning the team with a vivid vision, enabling the team to be effective as possible, and also ensuring that the team continuously improves. And when I think about agility, I think about these as techniques to encourage, build, create, really maintain strong teams. And I find that they become increasingly necessary as a company grows. I don't need to spend a lot of time on this in my own company at the moment because I've got a small team. But as the company grows larger and larger, I know that at Atlassian today, they're spending an outsized portion of their energy on these practices. So agility is not the practices, it's not the process, Scrum, it's none of that stuff. It's a state of mind, it's an approach, it's an ethos that our people, our teams, our leadership have that allows us to be adaptable and flexible as a company. And I think that's the most important thing, that we can respond and adapt to a changing business environment. You know, agility is teams at Twitter like Gazebo that have breakfast together every morning of the week that don't need to have regular Scrum rituals because of it. It's communicating a vivid vision like Mike and Scott did at Atlassian that aligns the whole team without giving them an instruction map of how to go and achieve it, right? Make people work through it. It's the Engineering Effectiveness Group at Twitter that trained thousands of people and shaved, you know, tens of thousands of minutes off the build, test, deploy cycle time every week, right? These are examples of agility in organisations. And these examples, you know, really help us build strong teams. Strong teams that have impact, they're focused on delivering value to their customers, they deliver quality, they minimise waste in the organisation, they have flow, they're delivering iteratively so that they can learn, they're running experiments, they have a hypothesis as opposed to saying this is what it's going to be. They have Kaizen, they're continuously improving how they operate as a team and how they deliver value to their customers. And finally, they have that courage. They have that courage to have forthright conversations with one another and the rest of the teams in their organisation. And it's with those traits and strong teams that I believe we can successfully deliver value to our customers. And that's what agility is for me at companies large and small. And so I hope from this You're going to take one practice, perhaps, and experiment with that in your own organisation and help you build some strong teams. Thank you so much for your time.